This video is about 2-5-1 progression. As the smallest subsection of the descending fifth sequence in a diatonic key, the 2-5-1 progression is the simplest and most direct way to form a cadence to the tonic using descending fifths. This is such a powerful progression that it is very often added in or used as part of the secondary dominant tonicization that we've looked at already. That is, since the point of the secondary dominant is to increase tension and momentum toward a given chord, then the addition of the related 2 chord before it simply adds to the effect. Let's take our simplest example and go from 1 major 7 to 6 minor 7. It's a very soft progression because the 2 chords share 3 notes in common and they're both tonic functioned within a key. However, if, as we did before, we put a secondary dominant chord in there, borrowed from A minor with a raised leading tone, the G sharp, and if we put that in between the C and the A minor 7, it makes the arrival of the 6 minor 7 seem to be much more motivated, more of an event. It's a very common, long-standing concept that goes all the way back to the Baroque era in Western music. Jazz and popular music composers of the early 20th century just took this process one step further by preparing the secondary dominant with kind of a secondary subdominant. That is, the 2 minor 7 chord also borrowed from A minor and made it a unit. So we have 1, 2, 5 of 6 going to 6. The addition of the 2 chord does a couple of things. First, since the second scale degree is a perfect fifth above the 5th scale degree, as we've seen, it increases the amount of descending 5th root progression, which they liked very much. It pushes the music forward, gives sort of an inevitability to every succeeding chord. Secondly, by extending the basic secondary dominant move with a further chord, it kind of smooths out the abruptness that secondary dominants can sometimes have. When we write a Roman numeral analysis of these progressions, we will just expand on the secondary dominant formula and write a 2 and a 5 with a bracket underneath it, and then the tonicized target chord under the bracket. So instead of a slash with the target chord, we have a bracket below both of the chords with the tonicized target beneath it. In order to figure out what a 2-5 progression to a particular target chord will be, just think of the key of the chord that you are tonicizing and use the 2 and 5 from that key. So just the same process as the secondary dominants, just add in the 2. Major target chords are always going to have a minor 2-7 going to a dominant 7th for the 5. But minor target chords will have a half diminished 7th for the 2 chord, as we've just seen, but also a dominant 7 for the 5. So the kind of 2 chord you get changes depending on whether you're tonicizing a major chord or a minor chord, but the 5, the dominant 7, is always the same. This technique of moving between chords with the tonicizing formula of 2-5 of whatever the next chord was became just a constant element in songwriting in this era. Composers liked it so much that they would sometimes use the 2-5 progression and then not even resolve to the tonicized chord. We're going to call these incomplete 2-5s, and you analyze them just the same way. You say 2, 5 of the chord that you would expect to see, and you put that chord underneath the bracket just like normal, and then when it doesn't arrive, you just move on. That is, it doesn't change the identity of the 2-5 that the 1 that you're expecting, the 1 in quotes, that you're expecting doesn't happen. It's kind of like a deceptive cadence in classical music in the sense that it's setting you up for something that you think is going to happen and then something else happens instead. To really get a handle of this, though, I think we need to look at an example. So we're going to start with Gershwin's A Foggy Day. Now, before we even start in on looking specifically at 2/5s, I want to say just a brief thing about how to approach analyzing these kinds of songs, or really any kind of music in general. Rather than start bar one, beat one, and go step by step, chord by chord, it's a lot more helpful, I think, usually, to take a step back and sort of look at the whole thing for a second. And the first thing you should look for is obvious places of cadence and rest. That is for tonic function chords, especially one chords. So to get an overall picture of just how the song is structured. So the first thing we're going to look for then are one chords. In this case, we're in F major, so we're going to look for F major 7 chords. A foggy day is unusual in that it comes back to the one chord very frequently. Usually these songwriters would sort of avoid the one chord, especially in the beginning of the song, because going back to the one pauses the forward motion, and they like to kind of keep it moving. All right, so if we look at it, if you look straight down the page, almost every single bar 1 of every system is an F major 7 chord, with a couple of exceptions. So once we know that those are our tonic chords, we can kind of guess what comes before them. That is, mostly, we get dominant chords. And then in this particular style, before the dominant chords, we're going to get a 2 chord. So as we look before, that is in the previous measures of all of these 1 chords, what do we see? We see that there are a lot of C7 chords. That's the 5 chord. And then if we look before all those chords, we see that there are a lot of G minor 7 chords. That's the 2. The little dash there means minor. So a lot of this song is made up of a series of 2/5 cadences to 1. That's 16 out of 32 measures. All right, so that takes care of a good chunk of the song right there. All right, the next thing we're going to do, since we're looking specifically at 2/5 progressions, and this is also a good thing to do for these songs because an awful lot of them spend their time doing 2/5 progressions, is just to look for the little formula. And the formula is some kind of minor 7th or half diminished 7th, followed immediately by some kind of dominant 7th. So if you see the little minor 7 or dash 7 and then a dominant 7th chord, chances are really, really good that's going to be a 2/5 of something. So let's just circle those for now, and then we're going to pick through them and see how they all work. So the very first thing that happens after the 1 chord in bar 1 is an A minor 7 flat 5, which is just a different way of saying a half diminished chord. I prefer half diminished chord just because it keeps things related to the triadic underpinning of these chords. The half diminished chord there, and then immediately a D7 chord. So we've got the chord types in the right spot. Then you just have to look at the roots. Do they go down a 5th? A down to D? Sure enough, it's a 5th. A to D is a 5th. It's a half diminished chord going to a dominant 7th chord. So it's a 2/5 of something. Well, what would it be? You can either say, what kind of chord does the D7 resolve to? Or you can say, what is a whole step below the A half diminished, right? Because the 2 in both major and minor keys is always a whole step above the 1. And it's such a small, easy interval to remember that sometimes that can pop into your head faster than thinking about the descending 5th. So that would be G. And do we get a G? Sure enough, we get a G minor chord. That's a 2/5 of G minor. So to figure out what Roman numeral we have, we think, what is G in the key of F? And it's the 2. So we have a 2/5 of 2 going to 2. Next, in measure 5 and 6, we have another 2/5 candidate, since we've got another half diminished chord, D, going to another dominant 7th chord, G. Very similar to the one in measure 2, just the roots are different. The roots also go down a 5th, so it's got to be a 2/5 of something. We say, what's a whole step below D, or what chord does G7 resolve to? And we come up with a C. In this case, a C minor is what we're expecting, since the D is a half diminished. And do we get a C minor chord next? No. Instead, Gershwin does one of these little deceptive switcheroos on us and doesn't complete the 2/5. All right, this is pretty common. I don't know, maybe a quarter or a third of the 2/5s you get in these songs, they're like little head fakes. They pretend like they're going someplace, but then they do something different just to keep things a little bit less formulaic. In this case, he changes the G chord, right? Instead of proceeding from G to C, he turns the G chord back into a G minor 7 chord, which is the 2 going to 5, going to 1. Okay, so that's a good example of a incomplete 2-5. In measure 10, we have another minor 7, dominant 7 pair. Also with descending 5th root motion. And this is a regular minor 7 now, not a half diminished 7. So we should be anticipating resolving this 2-5 to a major chord. And do we? Yes, we do. It's a 2-5 of B flat, right? C minor 7 to F7 to B flat major. So it's a 2-5 of 4. Why? Because 4 is what the chord is in the original key. We're always relating these back to the original key. 2-5s do not modulate to new keys. They tonicize the chord we're going to, but the chord we're going to stays in the key. All right, so it's a 2-5 of 4. And then the 2-5 in measure 14 is very much like that in measure 2, except the 2 now is a minor 7th, not a half diminished 7. So we're expecting a major chord, and we get it. Sort of, right? Because we're going to G7 again, which is not a major 7, right? So it's not really a chord that's at rest. So this is kind of a hybrid, right? We're expecting to go to a major chord, and we do, but it's a major chord with a dominant 7th in it. So what do? Well, we still call it a 2-5 of a G major chord, and since G would be the 2, but a major 2, we just write a major Roman numeral 2. And then when we get to the G7, do we call that 1? No, because a 5-7 chord really can't function as a 1. That's where functions come into play. Dominant chords are always dominant functioned. So what do we do there? Well, if we don't have a functional relationship between the 2 and 5 and this target chord, it's kind of like an incomplete 2-5. And that when we get to the target chord, it's not the chord that we expect. So we just call this a 2 dominant 7th, a 2-7 chord. And you might think, well, what is that? And our answer is, it is what it is, right? It's an unexpected dominant 7th chord. And these things do show up. And if you can't associate them with some sort of functional move, that is, this G7 chord does not go to C right after it. It's just a lone, we call these sort of coloristic dominants. They have a particular kind of sound, but they don't have a functional relationship. The dominant is not resolving. So that's just another little variation in this harmonic language. And if this starts to seem confusing at this point, just hang on. You'll get a feel for what kinds of things happen in these songs. All right, so we've gotten 4 different kinds of 2-5s in this song: minor 2-5s, major 2-5, an incomplete 2-5, and then this sort of hybrid incomplete 2-5 to a chord that has the right root but the wrong chord type. All right, so that's kind of 4 different variations on this basic formula. Just to recapitulate there, first thing to do, look for the obvious cadence points. Just scan over the song, look for any evidence of a 1 major 7 chord. That just sort of sets out all the strong pauses in the music, and that's just a helpful thing to know. Second thing we did is we looked for just the chord type unit, minor 7 or half diminished 7 going to a dominant 7th chord. And we just sort of took it on faith that those units were likely to be 2-5s. You can check, see if the roots go down a 5th. Every place that happens, you know those are going to be some kind of 2-5. A complete 2-5, an incomplete 2-5, major or minor, it doesn't matter. We just know what the functional purpose of those little units are. And then, in the instance of incomplete 2-5s, or this hybrid kind of thing where it goes to the right tonic but not the right chord type, we just label that chord, whatever it is, in the simplest way we can think of.